Mark, welcome.
Thank you.
To Sundays at 7. It's nearly 4 years since you were announced as Bishop of Chester. I interviewed you, I think almost 2 years ago to the day, when you were a year or so into post. How would you summarize the last 2 years since then? And in the second part of the evening, I want to ask you some, I suppose, quite searching questions about the issues that the church is facing today. So before that, the time you've been bishop up to now, what have been some of the highlights in the last 3.5 years?
So many highlights. Honestly, life is mad. And you say it's 2 years ago. It feels like either 5 minutes ago or about 3 decades ago, to be honest. And I think the tension is trying to keep the main thing the main thing. The church, like any organization, gets so introspective, so engaged with itself, completely failing to notice that we are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, whilst people have no opportunity to hear about Jesus. And actually, we're failing in our main mission. So the last 4 years have been about trying to encourage the diocese to discover the confidence that the gospel, the good news of Jesus, is the power of God for the salvation of those who believe. So to look outward rather than inward and actually revel in that. And there have been so many joys, the kind of building of team, whether that's the closer office team. I'll tell you an amazing story about that later because that's just so encouraging. Appointing a couple of suffragan bishops. We just announced a new archdeacon, the kind of wider team in the diocese. The church planting agenda. So I hope you know about Wirral Waters, not very far from where we are now. And it's just really exciting to be right in at the beginning of that development. And then some stuff which is just absolutely essential that we'll come back to later, how we navigate the challenge of safeguarding well, how we navigate living in love and faith well. Honestly, it just never stops. And some mornings I wake up and think, where am I? What's my name? No, I don't really. Yeah.
So you are and have been, well, you've always been a positive person anyway, but you'd say the last 2 or 3 years have been positive for you.
Yes, I sometimes describe myself as 80% Tigger and about 20% Eeyore, although Archbishop Justin told me off the other day and reminded me there were other figures in 100 Acre Wood as well. But yeah, no, I am basically 80 or 90% Tigger. So it has been good, but the challenges are immense. But the reality is, the darker the night, the brighter the light shines. And I have to say to you, I genuinely don't feel very good at this. This is not a kind of plea for sympathy. I really don't. But with the desperation we are seeing around us, just a little witness to the way that Jesus Christ changes lives, that's the business he's always been in, makes a massive difference. So as bishops, we get to go around confirming people in every different scenario. I was confirming here in December, dressed like this. Sometimes it's in all of the gear. But that moment when you hear people say, this is the difference that Jesus has made in my life, it's just amazing. And the best thing about being a bishop is I get to say to people, tell me how you met Jesus. And I'm almost never not moved to tears because just the beauty of the way that Jesus steps into people's lives and turns them upside down is just astonishing.
This year, we celebrate 20 years of Sundays at 7. And it all started when Rob Shimwell was vicar here. There are many people in the audience tonight who will have worked and served alongside you and Lindsay and will have fond memories of your family. I remember planning the monthly family services with you and with great affection. What are your happiest memories of your time here?
Oh, so many. I mean, genuinely, overwhelmingly, it's got to be the birth of the children. So we have 2 children, Jonathan and Peppa, now aged 22 and 23. Peppa's engaged to be married. It's just amazing. But they were born here in Arrow Park Hospital, so I always tell them they're plastic scousers or woollybags, which they seem endlessly grateful when I remind them of that. I remember coming into church, actually, with, I can't remember if it was Jonathan or Pippa, but in a pouch. And I think it was one of the Lavins who didn't really believe that I had the baby there and thought I was just taking the mickey out of Lindsay for being so visibly pregnant. So birth of the children, absolutely. Do you remember Skippy the clown?
Yes.
I've brought Skippy the clown with me tonight, but she's gone a bit grey. But you might see her a bit later, which is there. People coming to faith, that's got to be the highlight of any ministry. But the thing I was thinking about just a few days ago, bizarrely, I wrote a little course which was not brilliant, but it was called Without Doubt, If Only. And it was one of the first times I've been bold enough to explore what faith is all about. Because one of the dangers of the kind of lower part of the Church of England is we sometimes give the idea that faith is actually certainty, that we know for certain. There's a dreadful line in an otherwise quite good hymn that talks about the Spirit who clothes faith with certainty. And I think if he did, it wouldn't be called faith, it would be called certainty. And the reality is we are following Christ, which is an expression of trust. And at the moment, one of my key phrases that I'm praying through, and I find myself speaking about, is that the older I get, the simpler following Jesus I think it is to do. But the harder it is actually to do, because it's about stepping forth in faith. So many happy memories and lots of things I felt I growed in. That's not good English. English wasn't one of the things I growed in, but it's great.
You've had a number of different ministries since that time, in different areas of the country. I'm sure each would have been fulfilling and challenging in its own way. What is it about a role or ministry that makes it fulfilling and gives you, I don't know, a sense of grounding at the time?
I think that's a really good question, not least because ministry isn't only about wearing one of these. Actually, what Lindsay does, so Lindsay's still a social worker, is just as much a ministry as what I do. I have to say most days I pinch myself and ask whether I'm really doing this role, because it sounds like it's quite important being the Bishop of Chester. But I'm a simple lad who loves Jesus and tries to love people. And I find myself in all sorts of really bizarre situations, but actually that's what we're called to do. And then we dress it up in long words. So the word vocation is a word that I spend a lot of time talking about, because bishops have a role running their own diocese, but then also share the kind of leadership in the national church. So I'm the chair of ministry for the Church of England. And my son Jonathan, who's picked up his mother's sense of humour, says, "Dad, if you do ministry in the Church of England, what do the other bishops do?" But at the core of it is this sense of calling, which is, and I haven't really come to sell books, but I have bought some in case you want to read more about what I'm talking about. But that's why I pulled this book together. Where's the camera so you can see it? Which is called Faithful, Foolish, Called. And at the core of our life, it's not about getting stuff right, it's about following the right person. So what is it that makes a job valuable or makes a job worthwhile? It's that thrill of following Jesus into dark places and seeing people find life. And honestly, I find I get that as much wrong as I get it right. I moved from here to be, have I got time for a story?
Yes.
Honestly, I can talk for England, but...
No, I'll tell you any moment.
Okay. I moved from here to be vicar of the Red Light District in Doncaster, and some of you will have heard this story before. And I always used to say that was the kind of church where Jesus would have been a vicar, if Jesus had been a vicar. Right. And about 3 days after I was plumbed in as vicar, I was walking down into town and I was wearing one of these collars, and a girl behind me asked if I wanted any business. And I turned round and I had prepared about 3 or 4 kind of drop-dead lines, which just would have had her falling to her knees and finding Jesus within about 30 seconds. Except, of course, that's not what happens in those moments. And my mind went blank, and she looked at me and I looked at her, and I kind of waved my neck around, hoping that she'd see the collar and run away. And she went, "Well." And in that moment, I came out with a genius line, which you can write down if you want to, David, and you're welcome to use. I said, "Not me, I'm the vicar." To which she said, "It's all right, love, I've had plenty of them." And I said, "You're not having me." And I turned and I ran away. And it was a moment, it literally ran away from her. It was a moment of abject failure, where my kind of fantasy witness of being able to say something clever, and a girl who was addicted to heroin, trapped in a dreadful cycle of kind of prostitution, would find some kind of plastic salvation. But it's not how it works. So vocation is not about some formula. It's not about easy way of doing it. It's about following Jesus into the dark places and being able to improvise faithfully. And I suppose one of the things I've been praying for tonight, because there's all sorts of people with us, but also watching us, I guess, live or possibly later. Many of you will find it easy to look at somebody else, whether it's me or David or somebody next to you, and think, if only I had it sorted like them. But the reality is we are all thinking that, because following Jesus is tough, because we're in a broken and fallen world. And the secret to satisfaction, when Paul talks about, I've learned the secret of contentment in every situation, it's not about being right or perfect or knowing that you've got everything worked out. It's about the joy of holding hands with Jesus. I'll just finish with one story and then I'll let you move on if you want to. I have a brother and a sister, Ben and Rachel. My sister Rachel is very similar age to me. My brother Ben is much younger. So I remember I was about 16 or 17. Ben would have been 2 or 3. And we went to the Christmas market in the middle of Leicester. And it was the first time in my life, happened with my own children later, where I had his hand but couldn't see him. And the moment of panic in a big brother's heart, where I was responsible for this youngster, but the only contact I had was through his hand. I've never talked to him about how he felt about it. But that link, even though we couldn't see each other, made all the difference in the crowd. And contentment is not about knowing the way, it's about knowing you've got hold of the one who knows the way. So I don't know whether I'm doing a good job or bad. I don't think that's the point. The contentment comes from holding on to Jesus.
Mark, at the risk of you saying, wherever I am at the time, where do you actually regard as home?
Well, you asked me that question last time we were talking, and honestly, the answer is, it is where the Lord calls me to be and where the family is, because actually, we need to learn the secret of making home where we are called to be. We're always aliens and strangers in this world.
You've kept connections here.
Yeah.
And presumably you keep connections in every place where you've been.
Most places, in some ways, yes. So friendship really matters to us, and Lindsay and I have picked up the habit of trying to call in on people when we are journeying on, and actually being deliberate about the way that you make home in places, both locally and more networked, really matters. So I think there is something about security, there's something about rhythm, there's something about friendship, there's something about being part of a worshipping community, and if you're praying for me, and I'm deeply grateful that so many of you do, it makes such a difference. That's one of the weirdest things about being a bishop. I have 300 worshipping communities in the diocese of which I'm part, in fact more than 300. But actually that sense of home being where you can worship with brothers and sisters really matters. So I know myself to be someone who's moved around, but Chester is home for now, as a diocese, not just as a city.
Although we'll talk about this more perhaps in the second half, were you fully aware of all issues that you were going to take on when you became Bishop of Chester?
I was more aware of most of them than you might think. So remember that before this job I had been a suffragan bishop, like the Bishop of Birkenhead is a suffragan bishop in the Diocese of Newcastle. Yeah. And I'd also run a theological college. I've been principal of a theological college where you're paid to know what the issues are. So I was more aware of them, some of them. But to be honest, it was some of the silly things that I wasn't aware of that come with being bishop. So you might think there you're talking about the big issues in safeguarding or sexuality or whatever it happens to be. But actually, it's the other stuff that catches you out. So the other evening, I was out for dinner with a friend. And forgive me if this sounds pretentious, but it's genuinely true. You might think we nipped down to the local pub for a meal or what have you. But no, we were meeting in the House of Lords dining room because she needed to be able to vote when there was a division. So I sat down, and behind me was Black Rod, you know, the person who bangs on the door with the stick, who was dining with a dinner guest. And the bell rang for a division. So my friend and Black Rod went up to vote. So I turned to Black Rod's dinner guest, who I met politely just a few minutes before, and said, we got into conversation. Turned out, senior member of staff in the royal household. And she then said to me, so my lord, where are you bishop? So I said, Chester. She said, oh, you've got a big wedding coming up. I said, how do you know that? She said, it's been in all the papers. I said, what? The king knows about my daughter getting married. To which she replied, no, the Duke of Westminster, who of course is getting married. So it's those kind of things where you find yourself in the most remarkable situations, and you are there to witness for Christ in a way that few others may have access to be able to do. It's that kind of stuff which I have to say is more unexpected. And one of the things I pray is that I will be ready enough. You know, when Peter talks about always being ready to give a reason for the hope that's in you, in these utterly bizarre situations, to be able to be a witness to Christ. Because in some ways, it's easier being a witness in a place like Doncaster, where the need is so obvious, than it is, for example, being a witness in House of Lords dining room in that instance. Yeah.
You mentioned prayer, which is so vitally important, I know. Linked to that, once a week, my wife Denise meets up online with a prayer partner, and they share and talk together about personal concerns and issues. I know you love to pray with people and mentor a number of others. I know that. What's the value of that? Because it's an encouragement, isn't it? What's the value in that?
It's infinite. And the question is whether you really value having a relationship with Jesus. So the thing I find about the church, left, right, and centre, is if we are not infinitely careful and deliberate, we relegate Christ to a kind of formal role in our meetings. So one of the things, which was a habit I picked up after I left here, is whenever I'm chairing a meeting, I will regularly stop and say, would you mind praying? And I thought it was all right when I was a vicar doing that in PCC meetings or what have you. It's kind of all right when I'm chairing staff meetings in theological college or in the diocese. It gets rather more interesting when I'm chairing things in the national church. But people have just got used to the fact that I expect that Jesus is in the room with us. He's living, he's active, he's a real person. I mean, he's also God. But actually our relationship with him is absolutely central to who we are. It's probably why they've never let me chair General Synod, because I genuinely would stop and say, no, man, would you mind praying? Because that's what we should. But the question is, how do we keep that real? Because what we have this kind of tendency within ourselves to place ourselves into God's in God's place. Somebody, and Nikki, always, every time I talk, Nikki reminds me who it was, and I always forget, because I say it's Nietzsche, and she reminds me it wasn't. But says, in the beginning, God created man in his image, and we have been repaying the favor ever since. So that danger of ousting God, becoming functionally atheist, is absolutely massive in all that we are. So for myself, I try to make sure I pray with people. I try never to let people leave Bishop's house without praying. That's one of my little mantras. I don't manage it, but that's one of the things I'm aiming for. I meet with my own spiritual director, who's somebody that I will go and pray with, part of a cell group, in fact, with Lindsay, and that's good that we can pray together. Praying is just central to who we are.
We've got a lot to talk about in the second part, a lot. And just to conclude this part before we have another song, the Diocese of Chester recently published its vision, and the work on implementation and strategy has now begun. Can you tell us a bit about that and why it's important?
Yes, it was one of the priorities when I came to this diocese. So they draw up a kind of job description for the new bishop when they're coming in. And one of the things that the diocese wanted was a bishop who was going to come in and respect the fact that we are primarily a local diocese. We work through our local expressions of church. But draw together that sense of vision and strategy that we need. One of the things I've tried to absolutely keep front and centre is that this is either Christ's vision or we shouldn't bother with it at all. And that means for me that allowing the diocese to discern what God is calling us to be and to do really, really matters. It's a little bit like, and completely different to, the way that Lindsay and I tried to parent Jonathan and Peppa. So with each of our moves at the kind of growing age that they've had, we've tried to share with them the decision that we are making about where we should move as a family. And that's not just because it affects them just as much as it affects us, but it's because as Christian parents, this bringing up your children in the training and instruction of the Lord, actually one of the key jobs we have is to impart to them the skills of discerning God's will and way. Otherwise, how on earth are they going to do it when they have to make the decisions for themselves? So we separated vision from strategy, vision being where are we called to go. And my deep conviction is the vision belongs to the whole people of God. So somebody called Harriet Roberts, who's absolutely remarkable, led a massive consultation process. Over 30,000 people, we reckon, engaged in this in one way or another. And we were praying, we were looking and asking, where is God leading us to go? And the key question that came out of that was, what difference does what we are doing make to the 1.5 million people? There are 1.65 million people in this diocese. Rough calculation means that 1.5 million do not have a chance today, practically, of hearing about the Lord Jesus Christ. So what difference does what we're doing make to them? And there were 4 other quick sub-points which came to them, which I'm not going to bore you by running through, but they're all there on the diocesan website. The task we're in now is to say, so how does that transform into strategy? Strategy is about saying, if we want to be over there, what are the steps we are taking in order to get there? That's a quicker and smaller process, and it engages the things that we need to do now. But the key is to make sure that we stay local, because nobody was ever led to Jesus by a diocese. They were led to Jesus by another sinner saying, do you know the amazing thing that I've discovered? And showing them the difference that Jesus makes in their life.
You know, it upsets me. Children today don't even get to hear about Jesus in schools. They don't get to hear about it in an assembly. They don't sing hymns. They don't have a reading or a prayer or anything at the beginning. And I'm thinking, this is not a good start, because this is an opportunity. I know there are reasons why, but it's not helpful.
Well, they do more than you might fear, David. So we have 110 church schools in the diocese with an explicitly Christian worship curriculum. One of the things we're exploring through an national movement whose name just slips my mind, it's not called Fusion, but something like that, is how we can plant worshiping communities into our schools. And all of the statistics show, if we want to bring new people to faith, we need to be planting new communities of faith. And it's amazing how open our state schools are, if we will engage with sensitivity, to a gentle, faithful witness. When I was most latterly vicar, which was in Ripon in North Yorkshire, I engaged with all of the schools in the parish. But one of the secondary schools there, I used to get brought in to do sixth form RE, because basically what they wanted to do was just grill somebody who had a real faith. And the Buddhist RE teacher there used to describe me as his living artifact. So he would say to the A-level students, you can do anything you like with Reverend Mark. You can turn him upside down, you can poke him, you can ask him any questions. He revels in this stuff. I think he's got a real faith. Why don't you ask him about it? And those kind of doors are wide open. Yeah. So honestly, I'd say to you, of course observe those right things. Of course we're not there to proselytize, but we are there to witness. And I say to anybody who will listen, if you want to get Mark Tanner, the thing you need to understand is that I've met Jesus, he's alive, he changes my life, and he's the best thing that's ever happened to me. And I'll talk about him all day long, and I think he wants to get to know you too. Loads of other things will come and go, but that's at the core, and people are fascinated.
I'll start again. A number of people express their concern about falling church numbers nationwide, and feel that there is a burden on aging congregations who are working their socks off and constantly trying to plug the gaps. Is that something you have seen? And how would you respond to those concerns?
Yes, and the statistics are very clear. So we have the October stats, as we call them, in the Church of England, and obviously nationally I see those. Interestingly, after COVID, we've bounced back up to where we would have been if the statistics had carried on progressing without COVID, which is a really interesting thing. However, it's very much not uniform. So there are places of very dramatic decline, and there are places of really, really steep increase in church attendance, which is one of the things which is really delightful. I mentioned the office team earlier. If you came into Bishop's House office, you'd meet the newest member of staff, who's called Jess, who is just amazing. And one of the reasons I smile every time I see Jess is not only because she's got a brilliant northeast accent, which is, of course, where we were for about 10 years before we came here, but because Jess came back to faith and discovered something of ministry through a church called St. Thomas's right in the centre of Newcastle. Now, when I arrived in Newcastle, there were about 12 people who worshipped at St. Thomas's. The plaster was falling off the walls. It was just awful to go in, really. It just felt like a church which was on the brink of closure. We worked with St. Michael of Belfry, which is a church in York, and with the National Church, and a relatively small amount of seed corn money, and then a bigger grant that came along. And we planted a church which had to, the target was it grew to 400 within 5 years. It was at 400 within 1 year. Absolutely extraordinary, the way that people came to faith. And even now, I ring up Ben, who's the vicar. He's got the title of the Master of St. Thomas's, which has got to be one of the best titles in the Church of England. I ring Ben up and say, I'm feeling a bit flat. Can you tell me about somebody who's met Jesus? And without a doubt, he will say, well, yesterday, somebody walked into church and this happened, or this happened a couple of days ago, or we're baptizing 5 people on Sunday who've come to faith in the last 3 weeks. It's just extraordinary to see the growth. So what we need to do is ask, what is the church? You talk about people plugging gaps, and we are working hard to keep the ship afloat. But actually, we were never meant to keep the ship afloat, because the church is the vehicle where people discover Jesus Christ, have their lives changed, and then worship and witness. That's what we're there to do. So my question is not whether you're managing to keep the coffee rota going, or whatever it happens to be, but actually, are you about the core thing that we are called to do? Can I tell you one of my biggest frustrations as bishop? I go around talking about this all the time, and church after church after church says, well, that's right, Bishop, but the first thing we need to do is make sure we are strong in the faith. And it's always dressed up nicely, but that's the basic response which I get in place after place. And I want to smite my forehead in frustration and say, we are amidst a dying world. And if I was somebody who, for example, was running the St. John's Ambulance Brigade or whatever it happens to be, I want my people to come, and I might want them to know how to wear the uniform or what have you, but if there's a massive road crash which happens just in front of where I am, I'm going to gather anybody who's got any first aid skills and get them to help the numerous people who are there injured in front of the road. That's the situation we're in the church. Nobody joins the St. John's Ambulance, as far as I'm concerned, to wear the uniform. They join the St. John's Ambulance to offer first aid, to help. We don't join the church in order to run the coffee rota, even though it's nice having coffee. We join the church because Jesus has saved us and we want to be in a world which is saving people. So yes, we are struggling, but the answer is not to say, oh dear, well, we need to look after ourselves first. The answer is to rediscover our mission and discover in doing so that as we step out in faith, the God who calls also provides. I think I'm getting a bit passionate. Maybe I should be more bishoply.
No, I'm glad you're getting passionate because it's an important question. I'm only telling you what people say and what they think. And I understand because people have worked for many, many years doing their best. And they're now doing more than one, maybe two or three things, not just coffee rotas. And it's hard going in certain areas to keep churches working the way they always have been in the past.
And forgive me if I sound derogatory of coffee rotas. I don't mean to be at all.
No.
Genuinely don't. And I'm deeply grateful for what people do. But there are times that those of us who've been Christians for a long time need to leave our own sacred cows on the altar and ask what the pressing task is for now, because sometimes we just need to let go of some stuff in order that we can keep the main thing the main thing.
Some believe that churches have been left in crisis as a result of the pandemic. In your travels around the diocese and the country, have you seen an impact that that's had? Do you think that the church handled the COVID situation well?
I have seen an impact, and I've seen negative impact and positive impact. As to whether we handled it well, I think history will be our judge. Because of some of the things I'm aware of, I'm aware that there were all manner of backroom pressures that the Church of England needed to take a lead in responding to, which even now we can't really talk about because it's a very kind of sensitive subject. But I think by and large we behaved with transparency, with dignity and with integrity, and the level of local creativity that was released was quite extraordinary. So most churches I go around now will have this kind of broadcasting equipment, and maybe not this kind of quality of camera, but actually people will still be watching online. Our sense of being able to include people is remarkable. So I rejoice in the things that we have done. I think we do need a lessons learned review. I think that's known nationally. There may well be other pandemics which hit us. It's one of the things that the scientists tell us that we ought to be planning for. But by and large, I'm not in kind of beaty-uppy mode, didn't we do badly? But rather to say, let's learn the lessons which we have learned and then see how we can engage. One of the interesting statistical things is that if you look at people who come to faith through traditional church, the massive missing demographic is not only the young, but actually young men in particular. But if you look at the statistics of people who engaged in online church through the pandemic, there was a massive peak in the number of young men who were asking spiritual questions in those times. I think we need to attend to that and say, look, how do we attend to people? How do we attend to people whose first language is not English? I mean, there's all sorts of things that we were doing really quite remarkably well in the pandemic, and we need to keep learning the lessons.
Now, more questions on this issue than any other subject.
Football.
No. Over the past few years, the Anglican Church has been wrestling with questions about identity, sexuality, relationships, and marriage, and how these fit into the bigger picture of the good news of Jesus. Can you explain where we are up to in the process, including recent developments following the General Synod votes? There has been concern and division felt as a result. And I know you know that. How are you navigating this? What would be your counsel to us over this whole issue?
Well, to start at the end of the question and work backwards through it, my counsel would be that we need to keep our nerve and keep looking to Jesus. So the thing I am praying for myself, for those with whom I'm directly in contact, both in the diocese and nationally, but my question is, how do we allow Jesus to win this argument? Because too often what I see is we get entrenched in our camp, whatever our camp happens to be. And we simply find ourselves in a place where we are unable to engage with others. And I ask myself the really, to me, troubling question, which is Jesus in my camp? Because when I read the New Testament, actually, it seems to me Jesus has a remarkable way of not joining any camp, but challenging everybody. So what's my counsel? Keep our nerve, keep looking to Jesus, and keep the basic values, which are about loving one another, respecting, not judging, which is really key. There are masses of commands about that in the New Testament, and standing in that space. So, but then to jump to the beginning of the question, what have we done? About 6 years ago, actually probably more now, 7 or 8 years ago, Archbishop Justin launched a process called Living in Love and Faith. Archbishop Justin's background is in conflict resolution. He's a remarkably skilled person working in that area and has been engaged in it for many years in many different contexts. And his basic conviction is that if we will listen, more often than not, we find we meet human beings and a way opens up where we can find a way where we can walk together. Because the Church of England is immensely broad, we have people at every end of every spectrum. But the kind of core charism of Anglicanism is that we believe that God is bigger than we are, and actually, therefore, if we will pay attention to the scriptures, pay attention to Christian tradition, and pay attention to one another, we will learn more about who God is and how we are called to live today. And the modern church has a really fundamental problem, because if we just listen to the modern ethos, you get the idea that sexually, pretty much anything goes. I'm not suggesting that's what the church is saying, but that's a kind of cheapened version of an idea that you might get from the world. If you just listen to the scriptures in the same kind of stereotyped way, and please, I'm not commending you to do either of these things, I'm just trying to illustrate the issue that we've got. You get the idea that actually sexuality is only worked out in one very defined way, despite the fact, actually, if you read scriptures with an open mind, you see a range of expressions of that then throughout the scriptures. And what we easily find is that we find people divided into two camps who will very quickly just throw accusations at each other. So Archbishop Justin started this process called Living in Love and Faith to say, how will it be if we listen to each other? Where will we get to? Now, I have to say to you, in the last particularly 18 months, and particularly actually the last 6 or 7 weeks, things have got immensely fraught, partly because we've not been clear about what the process is, and the bishops have rather unwisely given the impression of a lack of transparency, and I have to say I recognise that and I grieve over that, which is why I've said to you before, you can ask me anything you like, because I'm utterly committed to being as transparent as I possibly can be in this. So one of the controversies, for example, is Synod was given the impression that the bishops had been given all sorts of legal advice that wasn't being shared. Now, for reasons that are too long to go in, that's not an entirely accurate impression, but to give that impression was immensely unwise because it takes an already tender area of things and pours oil or petrol onto the flames. Another thing happened in November. So the Synod took some very clear votes, and there were some really quite unwise political machinations made by people on all sides of this debate. And of course, Synod walk out the room thinking, well, that decision's made, now the bishops need to go and implement that, without recognising that's not how the church works. Actually, bishops have a responsibility to lead and have taken seriously the Synod votes, but anybody could have told you, and I walked out of the chamber saying, I'm not sure Synod realises that what they've decided will take at least 2 years to implement, even if it's done to the letter of one. And now the bishops are giving the impression that they are kind of trying to delay Synod vote, and people are not only upset by it, but very naturally hurt by it. So I find myself left, right and centre in a place where I'm thinking we need to have transparency in order that people know how we are taking these steps and where we're going with them. Because people do understand that these things are deeply complicated. And actually, when you talk to people, many people have a greater understanding of a view which is different to theirs than you might think. And again, this is not to particularly to advertise, although these are available on a table over there, and Rachel Schwan will help sell them to you if you want them. But part of my work over the last 3 or 4 years has been to write what's turned into 3 books. I've literally just finished the third, exploring a biblical way that we can stand in the middle of this debate, because it really matters. So the book that I've just finished writing is called Dancing with Powerlessness, because actually when you read the gospel, it's constantly about saying, how do we respond without worldly power in a way that changes the universe? That's why we have a crucified Saviour. This middle book, the yellow one, is called Called into Exile. This explores the metaphor of exile in the scriptures as a way of God bringing revelation into our world. But the one that I find myself coming back to time and again is actually the first in the series, called Clinging to the Cross. And you may have heard me say this before, because it absolutely shapes my faith. What I think happened on the cross more than anything is that Jesus holds on to the Father and will not let go, and holds on to us and will not let go, and in so doing bridges an unbridgeable gap. He reconciles the irreconcilable. That is the mystery of the faith, and we see it there in the cross. And what we need to rediscover in the living in love and faith process is how we stand in this middle place and allow Christ to win the argument.
It is a fact that over the years, over the past 30 or 40 years, major issues that we've had have been things like the remarriage of divorced people, women's ministry, and in all these cases, it's been a process. It starts, we move it along, and move it along. Do you see that we have started a process over the acceptance of same-sex marriage?
I think it slightly depends what you mean by the question. The Synod have taken a very clear vote that they want to have standalone services for the blessing of same-sex relationships. Whether that's a kind of ongoing process, I think we are actually, with the greatest respect, asking the wrong question if we set out, because there's a kind of presupposition of what the answer should be in that question. The reality is we live in a world with a very clear view of what humanity is, of who we are and how we're called to relate. And our task as Christians, if we believe that Jesus is real, he's living and active and wants to save people, is to introduce people to Jesus in order that Jesus can win the argument. So imagine for a moment that you hold a traditional view on human sexuality, and I'm a mate of yours who rides motorbikes or whatever happened, and I happen to be a gay man. How are you going to persuade me that your view is right? And I want to say, as soon as you ask that question, you're asking the wrong question, because the question is not what David believes, but what does Jesus believe? And therefore, your task is to introduce me to Jesus, so that if Jesus agrees with you, he can change my mind, because that's conversion. But if you do it, it's bullying. So all the time, the question is not, how do we win this argument? Are we on a slippery slope? I understand that. I've been brought up in that culture. But the question is, how do we introduce people to Jesus and let Jesus win the argument? And time after time, in the Gospels, we see religious people wanting to make a religious point, and Jesus quietly getting on with his own business, meeting people and introducing them to grace. I think there will be lots of people in heaven, genuinely loads of people in heaven, with whom we would profoundly have disagreed in this world, but Jesus started in a different place to the start place we're starting in.
Linked with this is a pastorally sensitive issue for many. And I'm aware that with many people, including church members, clergy and bishops, having received some appalling hate mail in recent years linked to the ongoing conversation. What is your reaction to that, and how do you cope with it? I received the other day a copy of the Joint Archbishop's letter, and it says in a paragraph, regarding LLF issues, although, of course, we continue to support robust debate around these issues, where there is disagreement in our church, we are dismayed that sometimes this has included unjust and inappropriate personal attacks. As followers of Christ, the manner in which we conduct our debate is as important as the debate itself, which is really carrying on from what you've just said. But what's your take on this? Because it's not been nice, has it?
No, and if I tell you that I have literally brought protective gear, protective clothing, goggles, gloves, and so on and so forth, for my office team, so that any suspicious mails can be opened behind a Perspex screen because we are that concerned given the tone of stuff that comes in. Yeah, that's absolutely true. You can understand the level of concern. I have to say, I have never been more ashamed of parts of the church than I have been in the last 2 years. But it's genuinely true because there is a level of vitriol which would shock you. How do I respond? It's like a kick in the gut every time I have it. And I have to say, if you're asking a personal question as somebody who's known me for years, I think one of the hardest things is when people who have said to me, we want you to be a bishop, are then not willing to actually exercise an economy of trust. So I really struggle when people say to me, Mark, we can see you voted this way, and that means... And I have to say, actually, it really doesn't. Can you have a look at the whole of what I voted on and not tell me what I think from one little tick in a box? Because you really, really don't know. So we are in a place where there is a low economy of trust. I've already talked transparently about that. We need to up that, and bishops need to take responsibility for that, and I hope that I do with others. I don't expect a kind of carte blanche. That's a dreadful culture, and it particularly leads to a dreadful safeguarding thing. But I do want to say, if you've got questions, come and ask me. One of the things I've literally written to all the clergy about last week is if you want to take action about this, please talk to me before you commit yourself to it, because almost always there are ways we can journey together. The truth is, even if you are the best and most accurate Christian in this room tonight, there is stuff about following Jesus that you cannot work out on your own. And therefore, let's work together. Whilst we are in the Church of England, we are in an ordered church. And the honest truth is, if I could stop being a bishop tomorrow, I almost certainly would. I haven't sought this thing, but I have been given a job to hold these things together. So let's act in grace. Let's work together. Please keep praying, because I'm the biggest wally in the room. But actually, I will try to lead you back to Jesus and to walk together.
Well, I would say to you now, on behalf of all people, I'm sorry that that kind of thing happens. And I'm sorry that you've received, not just you, but lots of other people, the kind of correspondence that I know you have. And thank you for at least talking a little bit about it now. I can appreciate the hurt that that causes. We've only got a couple more questions, and time just runs away with us. This next one's important, but if we try and keep it fairly brief. I want to ask you a little bit about safeguarding. I've spoken to a number of Christian church volunteers who feel annoyed that their suitability for volunteer work is questioned because of the actions of other people in the past. They feel that they are needing to prove their innocence as opposed to the other way around. Why is safeguarding so important? What would you say to someone who argues that it's all got a little bit out of hand?
I would tell them a story. Just before I do, though, can I just say the other thing which I was going to pick up in the last question was to say I am really committed that this diocese will be a safe place for all with a variety of views on LLF. And one of the things we're working on, and I'm really happy to talk to anyone who wants to talk about this further, is how we make provision to allow people with different consciences actually to stay together. So I'm really happy to talk further about that. But with regard to safeguarding, I would, if I possibly could, without breaking pastoral confidentiality, take them into any one of a number of what we call survivor meetings we've had, where we are talking to people who are now adults, often later in years, who have been abused by people in the church, often by clergy and sadly, often by bishops. I would let them see the utter brokenness, the devastation that abuse happens, whether it's sexual abuse or emotional abuse or financial abuse, the breaking of trust, the utter shattering of any relationship with Jesus. I'd let them see the tears falling down, but also the kind of broken body language. And I would ask them, after an hour in the room with that person, what they would not be prepared to do to make sure that just one person didn't have to go through that. Because honestly, having been through even a tenth of some of the meetings I've sat in, there's not a stone I wouldn't leave unturned in order to prevent. These are God's children, they're brothers and sisters. And often they've been, quiet children or approached in a state of vulnerability. There is nothing but nothing that we should not be prepared to do in terms of this safeguarding. So friends, I know it's a pain when you have to do this stuff. My wife, Lindsay, who we'll meet in a moment, is a really senior and experienced social worker, but she's also a reader in the Church of England. And so she has to do these courses. And honestly, she could write them. She really could. But she understands, and you can ask her yourself in a moment if you want to, that actually this culture really matters. So you doing safeguarding training is not the church saying, we think you're an abuser. It's not that at all. It's about saying we will build a culture which means that we can shine little lights into the darkest of corners so that there is nowhere but nowhere that an abuser can hide. Because those who are abusive actually are hugely manipulative. They find a way through systems. So we can't just sign people off because they're our mates or because we trust them or what have you. We have to have this culture. And it's not just in the church. It's in youth organisations, it's in sport, it's in schools, it's obviously in social services because it's in NHS, it's throughout. Do we get it right? Well, not completely, of course we don't. Is the system a bit clunky? Yes, it is. But it comes from this determination that if we can do something so even one person doesn't have to go through it, it's worth it.
You mentioned Lindsay a couple of times, and she's come with you tonight. You are a partnership, and there's a final question. I'd like her to have the opportunity to talk about this one, if that's okay. So would you like to, ladies and gentlemen, Lindsay Tanner. Is that switched on?
Hello? Is it?
Yes, yes. Gosh, you don't need hearing aids, do you? Okay. This is a question for both of you, but I think it's right that we hear from you to answer it, really. Most people here have been here many years and they know both of you quite well. And they would want to ask how the family are doing. Perhaps you can take us through this. How are Jonathan and Peppa doing? What are your concerns for them and the next generation? And what would you like us to be praying for? Plenty there, isn't there?
Yeah. Okay, so Jonathan and Pippa. Do you know what? They're absolutely amazing. Couldn't be prouder of them both. They are, so Jonathan, I can't really tell you what he does because it's a bit beyond me in all honesty. He speaks computer languages and writes programs that are making, or a program that makes other things go faster in the computer world, I think, and that will do checks and stuff. And I'm pretty sure that's the neat title of his doctorate thing when he finishes it, or words to that effect. He also does a lot of live streaming for weddings and lots of services. He's very broad in his churchmanship. The best thing about them both, you know, they both love Jesus. And that is a beautiful thing. And so Jonathan passionately serves the church. Whilst naturally he might get up more like midday, if he's committed to anything church-wise, he will be up in the early hours to deliver. So, and he's broad in his churchmanship from the kind of OIQ to, and Christian Union to St Aldate's to do New Wine, Keble Chapel, Chester Cathedral, all those places. Very, very dedicated and enjoys time with family and stuff, which is lovely to see. Pippa is doing medicine, and she is in the sort of 5th year of 6, and she loves that, is really enjoying different placements and stuff and work experience. And she also likes kind of outdoors and sporty stuff. She loves people, spending time with them. And she is getting married in September. And so we also enjoy a relationship with George. So there's now 5 of us, pretty much. Yeah. And he also loves Jesus, which is great. He's a mathematician, although our maths is a bit rusty. Right? Well, I won't speak for Mark.
Speak for yourself.
my maths is pretty rusty. So yeah.
Just remind us, what age are they? No.
So Jonathan is 23. Trying to think what year we're in. Yeah, he's 23. He'll be 24. Yeah, they're 23 and 22, and he'll be 24 in April. Yeah.
And you, in your work, in social work, and as your work as a reader, what would you value prayer for these days and the way that things are nationally, locally? What would you want us to pray for?
So for my work, so I feel like I'm parenting 350 16 to 25-year-olds who have been in the care of the local authority, young people. So they've been through a lot. And they face some tricky challenges. So for me, my passion at the moment is wisdom and leadership to be able to deliver really, really well for each of them, that each and every one of them can thrive. So that's my passion. And as a reader, again, so I serve in Holy Trinity Blacon and passionate about the community there and enabling them to discover the good news of Jesus, as you've already heard Mark speak about. I think for personally, because those things, plus life a bit more broadly, not with family, but also kind of stuff related to the bishop world, I suppose, just getting the right rhythms and balance and my own space to hear God and that kind of thing, because it's just difficult to navigate sometimes the demands of all those things.
And after 3 or 4 years living in Chester, have you settled in completely? Do you call it home? Was it home right from the word go? Or have you just grown into it? What's Chester like?
So yeah, I like living in Chester. I know I did notice a time when people asked me where I was from, I knew. So there was a while when I didn't know. And that was obviously because it had been complicated before that, a bit sort of where we lived and things. So yeah, there was definitely a transition where when people said, where do you live or where are you from, I was able to say Chester straight away. So that was a help. Yeah, no, I feel pretty settled, feel at home. Did feel at home in the house quite early on because I could wander around it in the dark, which was happening because I couldn't find the light switches. But I was quite comforted because I thought if I'm comfortable enough to walk around this house in the dark, I'm pretty much at home, so that was a good thing.
Great. Lindsay, thank you for that. We're coming towards the end of our evening, but...
Did you want, sorry, can I just put in?
Of course.
You know, you said about the next generation.
Yes.
One of the things that struck me was, I know there are all the challenges that you've just sort of intimated in discussion with Mark that young people also face. But I see, certainly in Jonathan and Pippa, and there's a real hope and opportunity. And I see in them discovering that time with people matters and loving people matters. And I see great faith. So especially Pippa, one of her friends became a Christian as Pippa led an Alpha course during COVID, and a young person, a friend of hers, became a Christian. And the stories that they tell of this new Christian's prayer life and praying bold prayers or hearing from God and then praying things and then watching God do stuff, as you gave an example of at the very beginning, I think gives me great excitement and hope. There are young people, young Christian people, full of faith, are trusting Jesus and wanting to see him lead, and they believe it matters and is everything. It's either all or nothing, and because it's not, because it's something, it's everything, and that's really exciting to see. So I'm not saying they don't face challenges, but also huge opportunities to pray for our young people.
Okay. You mentioned hope. I'd like to conclude this interview in a slightly different way. We've got a mixed audience here tonight of believers, seekers, others, all kinds of people. But we are all needing a sense of hope. As you've mentioned, the new diocesan vision is summarized with the words, together in Christ, sharing hope. Could you just share for just a couple of minutes, not to me, but to these good people here, speaking to them, your thoughts to give us hope?
I was praying about this earlier, and I thought I might just read you something, if I may. Is that allowed?
Yep.
This is a reflection from the beginning of the first Stones and Firelight book. It's a fresh day, yet here we are again. Bright hope of a new dawn marred by the behavior of the woman in front of us. She knows it's wrong, I know it's wrong, there's nothing to question. But I would still rather be anywhere but here. don't get me wrong. The Bible is clear, and I know what needs to be done. Keep this kind of behavior at a distance. It's a slippery slope, and letting standards slide in one matter only leads to the destruction of the whole. Think of Sodom. Think of Gomorrah. Look at the nations round us. God's judgment is clear. Don't let us be polluted, tainted by the likes of her. And so we gather, righteous, angry, certain. Teacher, we say, what do you say we should do? We caught this woman in the very act, and the law is clear. She deserves to die. I can't help feeling we've interrupted something. A conversation. I wish I'd been here before. I wish he would say something. And what's he fiddling in the sand for? We are ready, stones in hand. The only contact I want with this woman is to hurl my condemnation and go. Go and weep over her, over the world. Suddenly I'm not quite so sure. But what I do know for sure is that there's an unbridgeable chasm between the likes of me and the likes of her. I obey the word. She obviously doesn't. I am holy. She isn't. I guess, though, as I look at him, that I kind of regret there's no other way to reach across, as I suddenly realize how close I am standing to her. How his gaze catches us both without his even moving his head. But why am I even thinking that? The scriptures are clear and there can be no other way. Her death will deter others. An eye for an eye. Judgment stands as its own warning. Finally, he speaks. What's that? Well, that's okay then. And as the stone slips from my fingers, as it thuds into the dirt by my feet, as I feel those feet move unbidden and I slip away into the brightening day, I'm not sure where I'm headed now. Might I hear more? How can such a sentence be changed with just a sentence? Who is this man after all? How do I know the way ahead? It's a new day, and I am so glad I dropped my stone.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark and Lindsay Tanner.